every Christian that I've ever met that's a serious Bible-believing Protestant type of Christian will say these words at some point in their life. I know I did. And today, Thomas Westbrook joins me, the owner of Holy Koolaid. He was once drinking the Kool-Aid as well. But he has a series going on right now, you know, how the Bible history fails. Nothing fails like Bible history. And he delves into scholarship just like we do at MythVision Podcast. He's a brilliant mind. And I really appreciated this interview because it tells us sometimes, are we going too far when it comes to skepticism? Is there not a balance? Are we not allowing the Bible to be treated the same way we do other history? I don't know. You be the judge of that. We are MythVision. Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. Your host, Derek Lambert. You guys see who's on the show. Holy Kool-Aid, baby. Thomas Westbrook, man. What is up? Welcome to MythVision, brother.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
You too. Love your show. Everyone watching right now, take just 5 seconds, please, for me. Go down, subscribe to his channel, check out his content. I know that you'll love it. It's really, really wonderful. It's in the same vein of what I do. He's been around a lot longer, of course, and he has a large YouTube following. So make sure you guys go subscribe. I love what you do, Thomas. If you don't mind, you have a similar background to me in the sense that we were really Kool-Aid drinkers. You know, I literally picked this up before the show. I was like, look, if I'm going to do a show with Thomas, I've got to have a chalice that is going to mimic your chalice in your intro. But
you got me one-upped. I'm just drinking water.
Oh man, I'm trying to compete with you. You know,
the whole point is to not drink the Kool-Aid, which is why it gets knocked over at the beginning.
That's a good point. Your logic is pretty flawless. I was going to put skepticism in the cup, though. You know, I was trying to. That's a great point, Thomas.
Does skepticism come in liquid form?
I would hope. I don't know. It comes from Starbucks. So I just pour that in there and then we're good to go. So Thomas, tell us a little bit about you. What do you have coming up first? And then I'll be interested in hearing some of your story if you don't mind, but I don't want to just dwell on that because I'm sure I have a lot in common. And if you are watching, try to see if you relate. But what do you have going on? How can people help support what you do? And then we'll go from there.
Well, first off, as far as what I do, my channel takes complicated ideas, whether it's related to science or history or, there's a lot of pseudoscience and misinformation and stuff that's out there floating around that we've all encountered. And I like to take ideas and break them down, figure them out, research them, and then compact it in a laser focused way for people to wrap their heads around and understand. So if I see something in the news that, I'm seeing competing messages on a particular issue, or if I'm, reading and studying, holy books and they're saying one thing and then, scientists are saying something else, I want to know why. And so I try to get to a point where I have an aha moment where I'm like, oh, that makes sense. That's how we know that that's the case. And then package that down in a way that I could explain to me from a week ago. So that, if in that time period I, had that aha moment, I'm like, I want to bottle up those aha moments and share them out for other people. And I do it with visuals and I do, animations and stuff. And I try to keep my videos around 10 minutes or less. And unless it's like a long form interview, but
like your recent long form, that was really good. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I do. As far as upcoming stuff, I've been following the evangelicals who prophesied that Trump would win a second term. And it's been fascinating watching them double down on it, even up until like this last month. And they keep pushing back the prophecy and giving excuses why it didn't work. And I would normally just, it's like, this is nobody, I'll just look the other way. But these are people who have hundreds of thousands and in some cases millions of followers. There's an entire network called the Kenneth Copeland Network, and they have like Victory TV and stuff that have huge reach, entire, TV stations and stuff that are just blasting out content on, a ton of different shows. And they're swaying elections. They're getting people to vote based off of this is God's chosen candidate. And, that's what they're saying. And they're spreading a lot of misinformation and harm. And so I figure that it's if we don't call them out and, kind of show some of the stuff that they're saying, both the harmful stuff as wrong as the stuff that's flat out just wrong, then, if we're not doing that, then people tend to just kind of by default just be like, oh yeah, that kind of meshes with what I, heard in church or what I read in the Bible. And so I'm just going to go with it. And I think that that's incredibly dangerous. So I'm calling them out. I've been, kind of following them for a while. And then I've also been kind of diving deep into history and looking at the past and with the Bible, is it historical? Not, I haven't really gotten to the New Testament yet, but I've been going through things like the Exodus and, Joshua and the Tower of Babel and, working my way through it and trying to do it at a deep level where I'm actually, talking to experts and I'm actually looking at what archaeological finds have found and what we can interpret from them and, what's a stretch, what's more likely legend, what's more likely myth, and what bits are actually historical. Because there are pieces in the Bible that have historical basis.
That's well said. And I'm 100% in the same vein with you on trying to uncover what's myth, legend, what's reality, what's going on here, and how can we know? I love the Sodom and Gomorrah point that you brought up. You had the little mountain. One guy's like, this is it. And it's all like natural sedimentary, this just naturally happens. There's no way that's from lava or there's fire from the sky. And there's always someone out there trying to force the biblical narrative to be true or a place or a thing. And so I really appreciate what you do. Your long format video you did, Unearthing the True Origins of the Bible, was absolutely fascinating. You did that with the Religion for Breakfast channel host. And I really, really appreciated that.
Yeah, when you brought up the Sodom and Gomorrah video, and it's fascinating because when it comes to biblical claims, a lot of times, you have people who are like straight up literalist. Everything is 100% true. The earth was created in 6 days. There was a worldwide flood. People will buy into all of that, just hook, line, and sinker. And in the case of, Ron Wyatt, he was a literalist, but he also had no archaeological training. He had no experience whatsoever. He's a known con man. And he would literally take experts and film them and then quote mine something that they said to make it seem like they supported him. And there's even emails afterwards of them coming out and saying no, this wasn't a find, and they would denounce him afterwards. And, there's multiple experts that have done that. And so it's just not only dishonest tactics, but it was also someone with no experience. He's not going in and doing an archaeological dig in Sodom and Gomorrah. He's not using ground penetrating radar or satellite imagery or anything to he might have a flyover shot, one image, and he has no experience in actually analyzing this data. But he's coming in and just going oh, look, I found some sulfur. And it's yeah, sulfur is very normal and natural. Oh, I found this flaky soil. It looks like ash. It's no, it's the process of the Dead Sea. As it evaporates, it's layering down these sediments that are incredibly flaky. And geologists will tell you exactly how it's made and what it's made out of and stuff. And so that's the one extreme end of the spectrum, is those people who they have no experience. They're just coming in, with this bias and saying, oh, look, this, it's all, this biblical site. But you have people all across this spectrum of, kind of in the middle, you have a site called, Bab Edra, which it was a real city. It wasn't just sediment deposits. Right. And there were parts of the city that showed fire damage, and there were mass graves. And it's that seems, and it kind of seems to fit the area and the region of Sodom. And there's a sister city that was also ruined or in ruins, and it's called Numaira. And they're maybe this was Gomorrah. But you start digging deeper and you realize that they were destroyed at the wrong date. They were destroyed several hundred years apart from each other. They continued occupying these cities even after the burn layers, after that destruction. That, these tombs, these mass tombs, they weren't just for this city. They were from the entire region. And it was kind of an area, a sacred burial area that people would come and bury people. And all of these bodies were laid to rest over the course of hundreds and thousands of years. And they changed the style of burial throughout that process. It wasn't just that there's this one mass grave of people burning up in fire. So that's kind of in the middle. And then you have another site, Tal el Hammam, that's, a better candidate and you have an actual archaeologist going in and saying like, hey, this better fits the biblical description, but he's starting with the Bible. He's looking at the Bible and saying, okay, the Bible says that there was a city in this area, so I'm just going to go and look in this area for a city and then try to cherry pick and find anything that fits the data. And it leads to some really biased interpretations.
Yeah, like finding a city with fire burnt. Like, this city was burned with fire. Any raided city is probably going to burn. So, how do you? Yeah.
And he looks at this city and he says, hey, look, it looks like this city was destroyed in some sort of like meteor event, like a meteor, crashing into the city or something. And it's like, okay, cool. Like maybe there was a meteor that hit a city, and maybe that was the inspiration for the biblical city, but that's not an unnatural thing. Like there are meteors that hit the earth all the time, or asteroids or whatever, depending on the size of it.
Right.
And, so it's, for him to say, hey, there was a city that was hit by a meteor, therefore God hates homosexuals, and that was and these angels came down to warn Lot who fled and all this stuff. It's like that's a stretch. And even then he looks at this city and he says, oh my gosh, we found this baby in a pot buried in the floorboards, and it's just a sign of how evil and wicked this city was, because here's this baby, and like they were probably performing some like ritual human sacrifice on this baby. And then you start actually looking at the context of it, and it's like potted burials were very much the norm throughout this entire region. It wasn't cannibalism. It wasn't human sacrifice. It wasn't like this evil demonic thing, hey, I'm going to kill this baby in hopes of getting better crops and like bury it in the ground to have some, magic ritual. It was literally like you lost your child. And it's sort of like how in the States you'll have grandpa in an urn, the ashes, on the mantelpiece. You could come along and be like, look at how sinful these people were. They burned their grandparents alive. And it's like, no, you have to understand the context. Like there's regions all around this area, all the way up into Turkey. Like it wasn't just this city. Like if he's using this to argue that like this city was so evil that God destroyed it, and then he's showing this as his example, it's like, well, why didn't all these other cities get destroyed when you've got this practice in Mesopotamia and Canaan and Turkey and like all these regions have examples of, burying their infants in this urn. It's just the fact that a trained archaeologist could make such a blunder and just do it with such bold-faced confidence, arguing that this is proof of the Bible, it blows my mind. Because
Can I poke here? I think this is important, because anyone watching who believes in the Bible is going to say, Thomas, you hate the Bible. That's all. Just admit it. You just don't want it to be true and you hate it. But I want to ask Thomas, didn't you believe these stories at one point?
Oh yeah, I not only believe them, but like there are parts of the Bible that like I still think are historical.
Right.
I don't believe in, these grand miraculous accounts, but I don't think that there's nothing that you can learn from the Bible and you just toss it all out. Like I realize like everyone has a bias, but I try to come at it from the approach of like, what can I learn from this? What value is there to be found? What is historical and what isn't? And the problem is there's so many different, like if you start to study through history and you start to, look at both the archaeological record and the historical written record, you start to realize that there's a lot of things that are written down about, grand myths and legend. You've got the Iliad and the Odyssey and, all these legends of Odysseus, traveling around and facing these monsters and encountering gods. You have the Epic of Gilgamesh. You've got all of these, ancient Egyptian myths and stuff. Like, it's really common. It's really, really normal for humans to come up with these grand narrative tales of, these epic things that their ancestors did, and why, that's their, they inherited this greatness from these incredible demigods. And so for the Bible to come along and do something really similar, and oftentimes borrow the deities of the surrounding area, like in Canaan, the god El or Ale, was the head of the pantheon, and that sort of got incorporated into the Jewish tradition. You'll hear them talk about like Elohim or El Shaddai, and it's very much a kind of the same God. And there was also a God, Yahweh, that was the God of the Shasu, and that is the name of the Jewish God. And Christians could look at that and be like, oh well, obviously these were people who worshipped the one true God, and he always was the one true God. But when you start to kind of step back and get a bigger picture look, you realize that like polytheism was really, really common throughout this region. And then you started having, monolatry, where there's sort of like multiple gods, but one is like supreme. And then you have, monotheism, where it's just one God. And you see this gradual evolution and this gradual transition. And I'm like, what makes more sense? That humans like to create stories. They like to try to search for explanations for things, and that they will create these deities and create this grand, legendary narrative around events that oftentimes may have had like a few seeds of truth or a few, seeds right. to for the origin of the story, but then get blown out of proportion. We see this too, later on with characters like Robin Hood and, St. George and the Dragon and stuff. And no, there probably wasn't a giant dragon, but there very well could have been some dude, who was some knight that did something, Yeah.
Or
I don't know,
like King Arthur, or you can get into Paul Bunyan. Was there really lumberjacks that were,
Johnny Appleseed?
Right. And I love that you're doing that. That's what I'm trying to do. Like I enjoy doing this. And I think at some point I'll have the biblical stuff down pretty good to go outside of it, and let's nail the Greeks. Let's nail, in far more depth. But you believed this at one point, just like I did. What kind of background of Christianity did you have? And then what happened? What was it that woke you up? I'm sure it wasn't one thing, just like everyone. It was like a gradual.
I tried to condense down my deconversion process, and it was like a 17-minute long video, and that was the short scripted version. If I can do it kind of on like a Post-it note, I was a young Earth creationist. I was a missionary kid. I was a youth pastor, church camp counselor, like the whole 9 yards, worship leader, you name it. And coming from that background, I bought into it all literally. I thought that I was, like I said, young Earth creationist. I thought that evolution was a lie. The Earth was created in 6 days. It's 6,000 years old. The flood happened. Like all of that stuff, I believed. And it was sort of as I was getting into college, I started dabbling in different scientific areas and kind of learning more about, evolution, about, Big Bang cosmology and, astrophysics and, the age of the universe. And I started understanding why scientists say the things that they do and how we know the things that we know and what experiments show it. And I also started asking myself, if the biblical narrative, the young Earth creationist narrative is true, what results should we get from these experiments instead? And what experiments could we do to demonstrate that, this is the case? And I found that the religious, especially the literalist religious narrative, was incredibly unsatisfactory. So I did actually shift for a while. I shifted from, a lot of times I'll get accused of like, oh yeah, you were a young Earth creationist and then you just threw that out and you went full atheist. And the truth is, I actually gradually went from young Earth creationist to, well, I don't believe that there's evidence for a young Earth, but I think that, evolution probably happened and God was, the catalyst that set it in motion, and that there's still probably a lot of truth in these narratives. I still believed in miracles. And then I slowly started like no longer believing in angels and demons. And then I was like, wait a minute, if there was no Adam and Eve and there was no original man, because like evolution doesn't work like that. You don't just, it would be sort of like saying that, your parents only have, a boy and a girl, and then they die off, and then that couple has a boy and a girl and they die off. Like there's never a point where there's just two couples on planet Earth. There's populations that at scale are massively like spreading out and reproducing and stuff. And even then there's no dividing line between, just like there's no dividing line between like when you're a child and when you're an adult. Like you can kind of arbitrarily say midnight on your 18th birthday, but like that's so nonsense. Like everyone is gradually growing up at a different rate, and we develop neurologically at a different rate and emotionally, and in terms of maturity. And so just like you can't put an exact spot on like when you stopped being like a 2-year-old and suddenly became a 30-year-old, you can't put an exact linear dividing line between like, okay, this is exactly when we were this species and this is when we became this species, because everyone is able to reproduce with not just their generation, but the previous and the next generations too, assuming that you're still fertile. Like there's nothing stopping you physically in terms of, the sperm and eggs don't work together. Like that's always the case. It's just a really, really, really slow process.
Gradual, yeah.
Until you start actually seeing as they evolve, like you start seeing higher failure rates of, implantation and, fertilization and whatnot, and, delivery. And you start seeing various things that cause, with like ring species, for example, they, when two species will be separated for a while, then they may be able to reproduce with every other intermediate kind of species between them. Not species, but there's like gradual changes, but then they can't reproduce with each other.
Right.
And so you can kind of trace it all the way back around the circle. And it's like this, it's a really clear example of how one species kind of becomes two until they can no longer reproduce with each other, but they can reproduce with the previous ones all the way back around. And it's
Aaron Ra did a little. Yeah. Did you see Aaron Ra's little micro macro evolution video recently?
No, I don't think I have.
It's actually pretty well done. He's obviously dealing with the young Earth creationists that deny evolution. They say micro evolution's true, but macro evolution ain't true. And of course, he's like, no, thank you. That's
like saying I believe in drops of water, but not oceans. It's like, well, what do you think happens on, big time scales with lots of small changes? You get big changes. Like that's right. It's not a difficult concept. And so for me, it was like realizing that I was like, okay, so there's never a clear dividing line where it's like, this is the first human. And there's also never a point where there's just two individuals on Earth. And so that means that there was never just an Adam and Eve. There was never just two people. And so there wasn't an original sin moment. There wasn't a, Garden of Eden, eating the apple, did some terrible thing and fell. Now, some people would argue, well, but we're still, it's not this literal inherited original sin. It's just we're imperfect and we've kind of, evolved imperfectly. But then I'm like, then why would anyone deserve hell? And then people are like, well, hell doesn't really exist. I'm like, okay, so now you've gone from, evolution is real. Hell doesn't exist. There's no such thing as original sin. What's the point of Jesus again? Like, why do I need, like, if I'm not broken and damaged, then why do I need original sin? And then at the same time, there's nonsensical concepts in the Bible. Like, why is it that sin is inherited, but salvation isn't? Like, that's a pretty dick move on God's part. Like, if that was true, you can't have a system like that where there's this eternal punishment for finite crimes, but then salvation is not inherited, but sin is, and you're set up for failure, and then call that God this, all-powerful, omniscient, all-loving God. Yeah. That's where everything started to kind of break down. And I was like, okay, this doesn't make sense, but maybe there was a first cause. And I kind of slowly, as I started getting a bigger picture of how abiogenesis works, or at least the way that it could work in theory in the lab tests that have been performed, it's like the pieces to the puzzle started coming together. And it's like, you may still have a few missing pieces where it's like, well, science can't explain this. But just like if you have 1,000-piece puzzle and you have a few missing pieces, you can still tell this is a picture of a mountain.
And that's not a God of the gaps argument. That is a scientific, we have good theory, obviously, behind this, not a God of the gaps argument. They'll say that's an evolution of the gaps argument, but we'll leave that for later. I don't know how you fit all that on a Post-it, though.
That was a little verbose. I apologize.
You're fine. So here's a good question to ask in light of that, because Genesis is an interesting one. When you started discovering this, for me, I guess this was just my own personal, everyone has a different thing. Some people deconvert and they say, I'm done with the book. I'm done. I'm just going to become an activist for human rights and get rid of superstition. And they want nothing to do with this book. For me, I wanted to know what it was, since I always believed it was something. I wanted to know where did this come from? How did this magic trick, David Blaine, the magic trick happen to me? And I believed it. I was suckered into it. What was the magic behind it? And now I want to know how David Blaine does the trick, and where does the trick come from? Did you have the same kind of interest?
Yeah. And it's really hard to be that obsessed with your faith and your religion for that long and then just kind of quit and leave cold turkey.
Right.
When every single morning as a kid, you are raised with this book and you are taught that this is truth, this is gospel, and you study it and you memorize big sections of it, and you know all of the different arguments and all the different verses, and you learn it inside and out, and then all of a sudden you realize that like you've been very much misinformed your entire life on not just scientific topics, but history and other stuff. Like it's, and morality and social issues. Like there's so many things about it that you kind of have to, if you want to figure yourself out, when that's become such a huge part of your identity, you have to learn how to deconstruct it. And I want to know how the world works. So I will study, science and, psychology and neuroscience. I'll study, physics and cosmology and stuff, and I'll try to kind of learn human biology, and I'm trying to kind of understand all of that, while at the same time trying to figure out like what was it that caused this religion to take off? Why do so many people believe it? Are there elements of truth in it? What can we learn about humanity and about society and the way that we think? What can we learn about human history? And I think that it's been very therapeutic and helpful for me as I've been going through this process to know like what parts of it are and aren't true. Because even when I was, going through and studying the history of this, I knew that my science education had, had some major flaws in it because, it was based on this biblical perspective, but I didn't realize just how much of the history was wrong until I started diving into it. And I still thought that, there were large elements of the Bible and the, biblical history that I was like, yeah, this is 100% how it happened. And then I as I started diving into the history, I realized not only have I missed a huge chunk of incredibly important human history. I learned at a very surface level about like the existence of the Babylonians and the Sumerians and stuff, but I hadn't really dove into it. I couldn't tell you the first thing about, Acadia. I couldn't tell you about, the history of like, human writing. And I'm sure I probably learned some of this stuff, in high school, but, you forget things over time. But a lot of the stuff that I learned was just, this is the great kingdom of David, and this is the unified kingdom of Israel, and this was the great empire in the region. And now I'm going back through and I'm realizing like there wasn't a huge great empire. Like maybe there was a little bit of one in like the northern kingdom with like Hezekiah or something, but like there wasn't, or with King Ahab, but there wasn't. I think Hezekiah might have been Judah, but King Ahab had like a kingdom in northern Israel that's like attested to in the archaeological record. But
Syria has, yeah.
But you don't see this. You don't see this pan out in a way that the Old Testament is like, these are God's chosen people. This is the great kingdom that God has set up to prosper. And it's almost embarrassing if that's God's chosen kingdom that he's going to bless and prosper, because you look at all of the surrounding kingdoms. It's like the Hittite Empire clobbered them. The Egyptian Empire clobbered them. Like the size of these empires, like the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans and the Seleucids and the Ottomans and every single group that has come and invaded and taken over this land has been more powerful, wealthier, larger in every single metric, has just trounced them and put them to shame.
Something on that note, and I don't want to lose your track. Please try to pin that, because this is important what you're saying here. Of course, an apologist will say, duh, he chose this little nobody. They do say, that God chose this little nobody out of all the peoples of the earth. This is the chosen people, that they're not really that big. But I wanted to just take this experiment and tell me if you see things the same way I do. And maybe I'm overdoing it. So I'm interested in your correction on this. I did an analogy the other day on 3 things that debunk Christianity with a guy who's an ex-Jehovah's Witness. And one of the things he asked me when we talked about the God of the Old Testament was he has a problem with God's morality, which anyone who looks at the slavery, the condoning of such things, the women, the sex slaves, you name it, it's horrible. And of course, that's looking at it with modern context, but I think our morality is better than God's. But anyway, when I looked at Israel, or Jerusalem, Israel, if you want to call it a united monarchy, I don't care. You can use the narrative, right? Even if the history doesn't match it, playing with the narrative, the fact that the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, the Greeks, the Seleucids, the Romans. All of these people conquered them. And why? Their excuse is, we should have been more obedient to God's law. We should have done what God told us to do. But because of our disobedience and not doing what God said, our Father, so to speak, all this punishment, the raping of our women, the destruction of our people, the death, the famines, you name it, God sent that on us because we didn't obey him. And the analogy I used was, I'm a father and I tell my children that I supposedly love, hey, clean your bedroom. Every Sunday, rest, or every Saturday, rest. And some of those Saturdays, they don't rest. Well, an angry mob's walking down the street, and I say, hey, guys, come in here. I've got some disobedient kids. I want you to go in here and slaughter them. Teach them a lesson. Or come in here and do, and I don't even want to use words for the sake of the algorithm on YouTube. You can only imagine the grotesque, horrible things I could say. That is a picture I have in my head of the excuse that they give for why they're in these troubles every time, and cognitive dissonance, and they keep on going with it. Just like you talked about earlier in this same show, you talked about, I believe it was not before we hit record, where people are still believing Trump is going to come and reign. Cognitive dissonance in this belief of this apocalyptic or revelatory thing. So I don't know if you know where your pen was left, but do you agree with that kind of mindset and that view of what we're seeing?
Yeah, and that's where, what I was saying a second ago was how this region, this people group, it's not this great empire. So all of these promises of, just how incredibly great, and they're going to be greater than the stars in the sky and the sand on the ocean, and that, they're God's chosen people. And, he's going to give them this land. And then, like, for most of history, they don't actually even own that land. Like, they're completely under, the boot of the surrounding kingdoms. And so you see this, and it's like, okay, why is it that God will make these promises of, oh, you have pleased me, for this sacrifice where you burned a goat and you did these things that made me happy. And so I'm going to bless you to your, not to your children's children, but to the 10th generation. And then you have a couple generations later, oh, but so-and-so, displeased me. And so I'm just going to wipe you out. And it's, again, it's utterly nonsensical from the standpoint of, like you were saying, if this was a loving God who could come in and, correct them or something. And instead it's like, I'm just going to, kill you and slaughter you because I'm upset. And it's the same type of thing as
the world.
It's like the temper tantrum of, I'm going to flood and drown everyone on planet Earth to teach them a lesson. And it's like, so much for loving, caring, like, infinite mercy, trying to save people. It's like, nah, I'm just going to slaughter all of you guys and start over. It's like, well, what about the kids? What about the animals that suffered and drowned? What about, in the story of the Exodus, you have this people group is enslaved for hundreds of years. And yet they're God's chosen people. There's no mention that, like, oh, they fell away and that they were, this terrible, people that were worshiping other gods and doing these horrible abominations and therefore were enslaved. It's like, no, they just moved down to Egypt to get some food. And God's like, oh yeah, I just, it was a Sunday for 400 years. I'm snoozing. And they end up as slaves. And it's like, well, is that just for God's glory? Well, like, what kind of a incredibly egotistical dad would I be if I was just like, oh yeah, my son, suffered in slavery for, most of his life. But then, like, I brought him out of there like a good old dad after sitting around for decades knowing it was going on.
Or like Job.
Yeah, and it's like,
oh, I gave him a new one afterwards.
I did that for my glory. It's like, are you serious? Like, you're omnibenevolent, loving, compassionate in name only. Like, you cannot claim those traits and those attributes. And people are like, well, who are you to judge God? And I'm like, who am I to judge God? Well, one, if your Bible is true, then I'm made in the image of God. So I absolutely, have the ability to wrap my head around these concepts and judge right and wrong. And also you claim that, we ate, from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So, like, I have that knowledge, right? Like, so I can judge what's evil, and I look at the actions that God is doing and I'm like, that's straight up evil. So and obviously, I don't believe these stories, but I can look at them and see the internal inconsistencies and say, like, this doesn't make sense. Like, if you're going to try to convince me that this is the perfect word of God, you cannot present a book that is so fundamentally flawed, that has so many errors and mess ups and inconsistencies and logical screw ups, that I don't know how you can expect me to take it seriously.
What they want you to do, Thomas, the same thing they want me to do, is run with their interpretation, because what they have done is, and we know this firsthand, is they have cleverly created ways of overcoming these very difficult things. Does God know the future? Well, yeah, he knows all things from the beginning to the end. Really? What do you do with this passage where he like is surprised or shocked or, that's an anthropomorphism. Are you sure? I mean, sure, it could be, but God knows all things, but you get shocked and surprised. Who told you that you were naked, Adam? And so when we look at these other stories, that's why I love looking at the myths behind the myth of the Bible to find out where they come from, because that right there tells me how human the text really is. And I have a lot more respect for a human book than I do some magical book that's supposed to solve all the problems, and it really doesn't solve any.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of times when you study other mythology, you see similar narrative patterns and you'll see similar things. Now, I don't think that, some people will say like, oh, well, hey, look, this god, Mithras, did this and, was dying and rising, or this god did that. And so therefore, Jesus is based on them. And I'm like, I don't think that these are necessarily based on each other. Like there are some stories, like you look at the Sumerian flood myth, and it's very, very similar, and it predates the biblical flood myth by, a huge time span. And they're very, very similar. So it's like, okay, you've got this people group that, some of them went into exile in, Babylon. And so they are going to be exposed to a lot of these stories. It's, if you had a regional flood a while back in, you have a river valley between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that floods. And if you have a particularly rainy flood season and, there's this massive devastation, who knows? There could be some source or some origin that's, based in reality.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that the entire world was flooded, everything was wiped out, and that, one dude built a boat and crammed every single animal on it. Like, and
then God made a rainbow for that specific event.
to follow this chain of thought, if you have, there are some myths that are most likely the origin or the source of the biblical story. But that doesn't mean that just because there's commonalities that everything is the source of everything else. Like some things are just very common storytelling mechanisms. Some things are just really common narrative tropes that we use to communicate aspects of our humanity. The hero's tale is really common because it appeals to us at our core nature of, we set out on a quest to accomplish something. Like we have trials and tribulations and struggles, and we find ways to overcome them. And we have these climactic arches, and, we want to find love, and we want to get the girl, and we want to, come home heroic, having changed and undergone this process and learned as a human being and come out stronger for it. And I think like these types of narratives, like they appeal to us for a reason, because there are core aspects of our humanity that all of us can relate to, or most of us can relate to. So it's to see certain things appear throughout, various legends and myths and stuff. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're true just because there's commonalities. It means that, hey, people think very similarly because genetically we're very similarly wired. We share most of our DNA with each other. And, and there are some sources that kind of trickle into other stories, but, I'm not sure where I was going with that, but as far as the origin of this stuff goes, that makes really more sense to me.
Yeah, you did a fantastic job. I've really enjoyed this already. I find it fascinating that how do I put this? I wish I could lay my heart out on a table. People could see like it's not my intention to mock or bash or hurt. I'm trying to be as real and honest as possible. And I know I'm going to have biases, and it's going to sound like I just want the Bible to not be true. No, if there's a real account that something's based off of, I want to call it for what it really was. But I also do start, and I'm very open and honest about this, when I say that I am biased on the miraculous. I don't believe that. I start with if a narrative in a book said, "Hey, this happened," and it's so unbelievable, a dead guy who's been dead for 15 years rose from the dead, I'm going to say, "Who is the guy?" I'm going to be skeptical, and I just say that to say, like, I wish more people practiced that, but instead, and try to be honest, not overly skeptical, like we talked about before before we even hit record and hit the show. We were saying, like, is there too much skepticism, or is there a point in which we're not using valid methodology maybe at some point, and we're like going beyond? And this is the biggest attack I hear from Christians towards skeptics, and I don't blame them because it's their sensitive, sacred text, but they say to us, "You're going too far. You're treating this book unlike you would the Greek epics or the other histories. Why aren't you being fair?" And so,
and I think that, honestly, I think that that's a valid criticism. I think that there are atheists, and I think myself included, who, will or need to be aware of, that this is a pitfall of, are we taking our bias to a point where, we're not able to accept the parts that are historical, and that we hold them to a higher standard than we would other texts. And so a great example of this, and I know that you have, mythicists who watch your show.
Yeah.
And where I kind of push back against the mythicist position is, like, one, to me, it doesn't make any difference whether or not Jesus existed or not. I don't have a horse in the race. Like, if Jesus existed, I still think he'd just be a regular dude and not, the source of all these miracles and stuff. And if he didn't exist, well, then he also didn't do miracles and didn't rise from the dead and stuff. And to me, it's whether or not he existed, I have the same position that I hold right now. So I try to come at it from an unbiased perspective. But when I'm looking at all of these other characters throughout history, and I look at, say, someone in the Egyptian kings list, like, most people who have lived on the entire face of the earth over the entire course of human history have left behind zero traces of their existence. Like, almost everyone has left behind zero traces of their existence. Most kings have left behind no traces of their existence. Now, if they were some, great ruler or emperor who conquered all these regions and, set up all these monuments and wrote about their tales and stuff, like, they leave behind stuff. And we do find things, like, as we dig down, we'll find written records, and we piece together these histories and these narratives. But a lot of times, like, while there are some people like, Ramses the Great, who we have all kinds of written narratives, and, we have his mummified corpse, and we have all this stuff. And, like, there's this beautiful standard of, like, all of these different things that we piece together to show, who he was, what his life was about, and tell his story. And it's demonstrable that he existed. You're not going to find that level of evidence with most people in most places. And part of that is that Egypt preserves stuff because it's dry, and other places, don't as well because they're more humid and stuff breaks down. But that said, if you look at, like, a Sumerian kings list or an Egyptian kings list, and you see that, they've recorded all of these names of rulers that lived in this area, and all you have is, like, one mention of so-and-so lived, and ruled the kingdom for 23 years and then he died, no historian is going to doubt that unless there's a reason to doubt it. If there's another king's list that leaves them off, if there's conflicting dates, then all of a sudden you have conflicting theories of which one is true, which one is right. But if you just have written down, like, there was a dude who lived, that's not an extraordinary claim.
Well,
people live all this.
The interesting thing that you're saying, and I find this fascinating about the Sumerian king list, that we see and I've seen scholars actually do this with the genealogy and the Genesis narrative going into the Noah's flood. How long did they live? 30,000 years or whatever.
Yeah.
Like, and it's
and here's the thing. I should make a distinction though, because the Sumerian kings list is not the best example. I would say that the Egyptian kings lists are better because, like, they actually have realistic time frames of how long people lived. The Sumerian kings list is like they have lists of names, but they'll put these astronomical years next to them. And but so that's
even if that's the case, there's really no reason to deny that the Sumerian kings may not have or may have existed, meaning there's no reason to doubt that they didn't exist.
Other than the lengths of their life.
The dates, yes. Yeah. So are they mythologized? Is there a numerological reason they put the dates there? Yeah, sure. They mythologized the dates. I don't see any problem with that.
when it comes to this type of thing, it's like, yeah, I do start to get more skeptical with these, so-and-so lived for 30,000 years.
Yeah.
But at the same time, a lot of people would trace their lineage back and be like, I am a descendant of Sargon, or of this person or whatever. And it's like, there probably was some dude that had some stuff written about him that was a king. Yeah. But other than that, depending on which one, first of all, there were multiple Sargons, but if you start looking at like the Egyptian kings list and you read about Amenhotep or something, and it's like, okay, there probably was a dude. And even if you had nothing else but a king's list, there probably was a dude with that name, right. And he probably was a pharaoh. And that's not unreasonable to assume, because we know that there were hundreds of hundreds of thousands of people that lived throughout this time in this region, and you had lots of pharaohs. You had over almost 30 something dynasties. And so it's like, it's not a wild, extraordinary thing. Like, it's well within the confines of what we know happens. And it's the same as saying, like, right now there's 7 billion people living on planet Earth. So to assume that there was a dude that lived with a certain name a while ago, that's not an unreasonable claim. Now, when people start claiming that, someone walked on water and they multiplied fish and loaves and they raised the dead and they themselves rose from the dead, and like when they died, hundreds of zombie people just like emerged from their graves and walked around, but no one recorded it. It's like, now you start getting into the realm of like ridiculous legend. Right. But we know that in terms of, there being a dude named Jesus was one of the most common names at the time, or Yeshua, which was like Joshua. We know that they had all of these, prophecies and stuff about like a messianic figure. We know that there were apocalyptic prophet type figures that would come up and spread these messages and preach. And we know that, that there's actually a lot that you can learn from like the Qumran like communities and stuff, that you start to learn about characters like John the Baptist, and you start to like the Essenes and stuff. You start to kind of get a bigger picture in it, and it fits with this narrative. And like, there are people in this time and place that are mentioned in the Gospels that what's his name, King Herod and stuff, that, it's there are some things to tack to reality. We know that the Romans had conquered that area and were dominating that area. Like, these accounts were written not hundreds of years or thousands of years after his life, but close. Yeah. Like, within several decades of his death, that you start having Paul and then, the Gospels and stuff writing about him. And then you start having a few other mentions and stuff. And it's like, is it possible that he didn't exist at all? Maybe. Yeah. But, and I'm not going to say one way or another, but to me, it seems like a stretch, and it feels like you're holding the standard of evidence for simple existence. You're holding the existence of Jesus to a higher standard than you would to these other characters. It's like, did he exist? That's not an extraordinary claim. Like, someone existing is the most ordinary, mundane thing. Like, was there a dude named Jesus who preached about stuff? Like, based off of what we have written, like the amount of evidence for that, to me, is satisfactory. It's like, sure, there was probably a dude. I'm not going to contest that. I don't care. I don't doubt it.
I like what you're saying, Thomas. If you don't mind me just giving this one little praise to what you said. And that's the train of thinking that I had, because when I went from fundamentalist Christian and I deconverted, literal postage stamp explanation of my deconversion. Not your version of a post-it, because your post-it, like, I'm just kidding. But anyway, I started looking at comparative mythology, and I openly say, like, I saw that Zeitgeist movie and I thought, holy crap, Jesus is a Xerox copy of all these other gods and things like that. So I started to look into it. And then I found scholars who actually have comparative mythology stuff. And I started to like, wow, this is substantial. This isn't just a nice little movie that's 2 hours that pop atheists like to watch. There's some like really substantial stuff to show comparative things. When I delved into that, I went from God is only in Jesus and Jesus is the only way to, no, God's in every religion, and he's culturally showing his own expression throughout all the cultures. And God's like that, the 6 wise men of Hindustan, he's the elephant and everyone's blind trying to figure out what he is, but he's there. To science. Science played a huge role in the scientific method on me deconverting and starting to be critical instead of trying to reinterpret the meaning of these texts to make it astrotheology or allegory or to explain it, to keep the book protected in some sense. I started to actually poke into the book and say, hold on, we have a problem here. And so I became a mythicist for a long time. Then I started to consider evidence, really, and this is just my honest journey. And what you said and how you expressed that is why I went from mythicist to agnostic to I'm agnostic, meaning I don't know, but I lean on the historicist side for many mundane reasons. And what really gets me, and I wanted to say this is what makes Christianity difficult is when you look at the sources, you see that there was an early Jewish movement that probably was Jewish only, in fact. But then I suspect this spread out into a diaspora. And when the diaspora Jews started to catch on, or if maybe it originated in the diaspora, there were God-fearer pagans that would attend synagogue, and the pagan Gentiles get a hold of it. And anyone who knows how pagans deal with things, they mythologize the hell out of some stuff. So here you have Jesus going from a mundane preacher who's teaching, keep the law. I didn't come to destroy the law and the prophets. I came to establish it and circumcise and obedience type stuff in a Jewish vein to don't worry about circumcision, Paul. And it radically changed. This movement is now addressing in a completely different audience. So I see why mythicists do that. It's like, hold on, don't drive that nail in too deep. I think we need to try. Here's the thing you said at the beginning. I'll shut up after this. It doesn't matter if he exists or not. You're right about that. And if we're trying to address the Christian world and help wake people up, I don't know if a mythicist position is the best argument to present to someone when it's not an extraordinary claim to say a human existed. So I like people like Apologia. Apologia literally will play in the sandbox of the Christian till the cows fly. And in that sandbox, he's still breaking down their methodology and their movement, using the book itself, using the movement's teachings and everything. So anyway.
I want to be careful when it comes to, trying to explain the origin of, the mythological aspects of, or the legendary, crazy grand aspects of Christianity, because, I want to be careful not to speculate, because there's some things that we know about the area and the region, and we can make theories as to where it might have come from, but without hard evidence, they're theories, and we can have multiple competing theories that may fit what we know about the region and the people and the times and the text, but without hard evidence, to say this was definitively the source of the mythological aspect. I want to be a little cautious there.
It could be not Gentiles. This could be Hellenistic Jews like Philo and others, or even looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls. There's some movements there that have some extremely superstitious concepts.
And I also want to be careful to say, I'm not a historian. I'm a hobbyist. And I'm not an expert on the whole New Testament origins of, I've read a little bit on kind of the mythicist position, and I've kind of looked into it, and I've watched some debates and stuff, and I've looked into Richard Carrier and Bart Ehrman and Dr. Robert Price and stuff. And I've seen some of the arguments that they've put forth, and I haven't been convinced by the mythicist position, but I don't want to come off as an expert, because I'm not.
Right. This is for fun, Thomas. I know. And for our audience is why ultimately we're saying this, is so they understand. Look, this is a journey. We're still on this journey. We're still learning. Who knows what kind of evidence we might uncover? I hope we find more, honestly. I hope we discover more. And we were looking for healthy skepticism is our point. Yeah.
So, and I wanted to also respond to, you said that it may not be the best approach to if you want to reach people or change minds and stuff. And I think that you're right in that regard, that if your goal is to change people's minds and you come out with this fringe theory that's oh yeah, he didn't even exist. Yeah, you're probably going to be dismissed with the same level of someone who claims that they went walking in their cornfield and that they met an alien who beamed them up to their spaceship. And so there's that, but also I'm not sure that my goal is to just go out and deconvert everyone and make them all atheists and show them that it's wrong. Like, my goal is to figure out like what's true and to encourage people to use scientific skepticism, to encourage people to learn how to, not just to tell them, hey, here's what this says and that's what you should believe it because I say it. No, I want to show people like, this is how you can explore the evidence and this is how you can compare two sources and see like what's more reliable than the other. And, you know, I'm kind of amazed how, you know, people will oftentimes they'll get a rudimentary understanding in like high school or junior high of like the scientific method, but nobody learns the historical method and they don't know how to do like a critical textual analysis of like different sources and try to see like how much merit there is and how likely they are to be true. And if we had that and then we applied that to our own religious beliefs, then I think that would cause a lot more people to think more critically and maybe be a little more skeptical. And then we would also, like, as we teach scientific skepticism, we teach people to, you know, not to just be cynical and not just to be contrarian or just to, you know, doubt everything for no good reason, but we teach people to use a healthy amount of caution until the evidence that is required to believe something is there. So for some ordinary mundane claim like, hey, I had a burger for lunch yesterday, there's no reason to doubt that. Whereas if I say, you know, hey, I hopped in my car and it transformed into Bumblebee and then like launched into space somehow, then it's like, that's an extraordinary claim. But if I, you know, actually took you to my garage and showed you and filmed the whole thing and had some scientists come and run some tests on it and, you know, with live cameras and stuff, like that's the extraordinary evidence that you would need to see like, oh, hey, this technology is real and it exists and cool. Hey, Transformers, more than meets the eye.
Right.
It's, you know, understanding that like extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I know it's kind of a cliche, but it's so true. It's like, if I just put forth some, you know, ordinary claim, like it's not that you have to just be skeptical and doubting every little thing. It's that when someone puts something that where there's a reason for there to be a red flag because it's not something that matches with how the world works, or at least how we're pretty sure that the world works. If we're going to adjust everything that we know about the world and completely change all of the scientific models that, I'm not just talking about like new fringe science that we're exploring. I'm talking about areas that like we have a significant amount of evidence for centuries in multiple fields of science, all overlapping on one specific theory or one specific position. And there's an overwhelming reason why there's a 100% consensus among all of the experts who dedicate their life to this. Like if something is going to come along and completely, you know, run contrary to that belief, it's going to take a lot more solid evidence to overturn that theory than something that's just completely in line with everything that we know about how the world works. And that's why when someone says like, oh yeah, you know, evolution isn't true and, you know, the dead can come back to life and, you know, a man can walk on water, you know, it's going to take more for me, you know, I mean, maybe he had like some boat shoes or something, you know, I don't know, but like, you know, maybe he pulled some David Blaine stuff. Like that's not an extraordinary claim. Like claiming that it was just a natural explanation or some magic trick, that's not an extraordinary claim. But claiming that he was able to completely overturn the laws of physics and completely reverse his own, you know, density, and so to where he was buoyant enough to just kind of bobble along the top of the water, like that is an extraordinary claim. And that would require some sort of demonstration or some sort of
birth or anything, really. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That makes perfect sense. And I think that I want more people to think skeptical. I'd like to see these religions become, I guess you'd say, evolve, get rid of some of the harmful tenets of them, especially the cults that I've been interviewing, ex-members of like Jehovah's Witnesses. They have, you know, disfellowshipping and the shaming and stuff. Those harmful practices that we see from Scientology, they're horrible. Like there's so many like horrific things that come from it. But I want to see these religions move into the modern day and get rid of some of these horrible practices. If people have a tradition they want to hold to, I mean, I interview scholars like Dr. Goodacre or PhD candidate at Duke University, Ian Mills. I interview him all the time. He's a Christian. And we did an interview. We talked about some stuff that I couldn't even imagine how a Christian could believe that or say that. and it's his historian hat. It's his education that he's saying this. But at the same time, I'm like, why are you a Christian? He says, well, I choose to want to be a Christian. I like the morals. I like to be this kind of person. And that's my own choice. And I'm like, I'm not knocking you. So I get it.
But there's a difference between believing something because we want it to be true or because we're scared of the alternative versus believing it because like that's where the evidence has led us.
Right.
And I want to go where the evidence leads. I want to know what's true. I want to follow what's true. And, I think that when we are skeptical and we apply a skeptical lens towards everything, then it will help us to look at some of the harmful beliefs and see, is there any merit to this? So, for example, Jehovah's Witnesses, I believe, will say, like, you can't get a blood transfusion. Yep. And to me, that's so mind-baffling that you could look at this and be like, hey, here is this form of technology, this medical breakthrough that saves countless lives every year. And you have a chance to allow your children to live and to survive and to breathe and to continue living. And it's like, even if the Jehovah's Witness position was true, here's a chance where you can have someone to go on to maybe save other people for the religion and to go out and share the gospel because they got another 20 years of life or 50 years of life because they got a blood transfusion. And instead, it's just like there's some weird archaic, excuse as to, well, if we read this verse this way, it sounds like this new technology that wasn't even invented yet is bad. So, we shouldn't do it.
I actually had a Jehovah's Witness the other day say to me that the evidence, if you will, is that blood transfusions don't work that much. They really don't work that often. Yeah, I know, right? So
I'm sorry. I'm not even going to dignify that with a response. Like, go look up how many people's lives have been saved by blood transfusions. Talk to any doctor or nurse. Like, that's BS.
And they're teaching their circles that. That's what I don't care if people want to believe. My wife believes in a spiritual. She doesn't want to use the word spiritual, but she says she thinks there's something out there that's the cause of all this, Thomas. And she said, I just want to believe that. And I just don't see how this is how existence is without something up there or out there or something that made it happen. That's her proposition, right? So I don't knock that. So, Thomas, I really want to do this again with you. You not only are fantastic at what you do and explaining these things, I encourage you to keep going, man. I want my audience to come and subscribe to you. You really have a really good way of presenting this evidence. Your head is wrapped around this knowledge. I appreciate your demeanor and how you are trying to approach those who were once like us. You don't want to become the opposite and the Darth Vader of religion. Well,
I think that there's two extremes. There's the one extreme that we've already talked about, which is that you have the atheists and the skeptics who are like, none of it is real whatsoever. Just throw it all out, and there's no value, no merit whatsoever. And even if they're presented with sufficient evidence, they'll hold it to a higher standard. And, they may be right and it may all be garbage and stuff and not true. But I think that that's not healthy skepticism. That is, it's contrarianism. It's simply, saying, no, none of it, and no matter how much evidence that they see, they won't accept it. And then I think that there's the healthy middle ground. That's like the evidence needs to match the claim for me to believe it. And then the other end of the spectrum that we haven't really touched on in this interview is the Christians who will have the same biased approach as the people on the other extreme, where they're just like, I'm going to accept anything and everything, even if it's like a shoddy piece of evidence. If it confirms my belief, I want this to be true. And so I am going to, instead of trying to analyze the context and figure out if it's true, I'm going to search through the data and try to find and cherry pick anything and everything to build this case. Mm-hmm. And so it's no matter how much evidence there is to the contrary, that might get ignored or thrown out in a practice of cognitive dissonance. And if there's, competing theories or competing positions, they're not held on equal weight. Even if the evidence is on equal weight, the one that, the Bible puts forward is favored. And right. So there is this favoritism of sources there, just like, I warn against atheists favoring a non-religious source and giving it more merit than it deserves, or they might give it what it deserves and then give the Bible less. And so I'm like, yeah, they both might make these extraordinary, miraculous claims. And so, yes, there is reason to doubt both of them. And there are legitimate reasons to have some skepticism. But there might be little nuggets of truth in each of them. And that's where you start diving into the historical record and not just what people have written down, but the archaeological record, and seeing like, is there evidence of this? You'll find like a seal of Hezekiah, or you'll find, inscriptions and things. And you're like, okay, there's no reason to believe that there couldn't have been a dude like this. It fits with everything that we know of the history of the time. Cool. I'll give it to him. Yeah. So it's that healthy middle ground that I want more people to adopt. It's like, yeah, I understand like people might be, completely, in love with their religious belief, or they might be, hurt by it. And, there can be bias that's created. But if you really care about pursuing the truth, you should do your best to try to examine both sides as objectively as you can. And when you start to feel an emotional urge rising up, kind of try to silence that and kind of quiet it down, take a deep breath, and re-examine the evidence and say, like, what's the probability of each of these beliefs based off of what we know, and why are experts leaning one way or another, and what is their argumentation that they're presenting for it?
I like that you said experts, because we can get caught up in pseudo concepts or pseudo historian, if you will, someone who's going out there and not really considering why the will has been invented on these methodologies and learning the history and going into this stuff. So
do your own research does not mean spend an hour on watching Ancient Aliens. Like, I'm sorry, but
even though it's entertaining, it's definitely not something you should go to get all your
until you can open up a academic article published by PhDs that is really kind of diving into this, and be able to either break it down or talk to an expert and have them break it down and understand it. You have not done your own research.
Right.
And even then, you're not doing your own research. You're understanding their research.
You're hitting something so important, because I've dealt with these various groups, since I've had this channel, that hold to interesting theories, but I don't even call it a theory. It's a hypothesis. One of these hypotheses, for example, are that the Gentiles that Paul is preaching to are Israelites. They're not pagans. And I know that sounds like, what? And there's this long explanation for a two-house theory that the United Monarchy, when it was divided and the northern lost Israelites would come back, that these Gentiles are actually these lost Israelites throughout the nations that are coming back, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, the point is they claim, anti-academia, the academic circles are all just church propaganda continuing. It's this really conspiracy theory is what I call it. And the problem with that, and I recommend everyone who's looking into this, at least know what if you want to call them so-called experts, at least know what they say, understand the arguments in the field of expertise, then argue against it, knowing what they say. Don't come into this, everyone's wrong and I'm right, with a cognitive bias type of position where you want the Gentiles to be Israelites because you don't want it to be talking to someone who may not be an Israelite because for some reason might be talking to you. That's how they feel. They think it might be talking about them. They don't want to be part of the narrative because they don't want to be Christian. I told them, you don't have to disprove Christianity using that method. Yeah.
It's okay to say, I don't know. And to hang your coat on the peg of, disbelief until you have a reason to believe, or to and I say disbelief, but it's more like suspending belief, saying like, I don't know, I'm going to wait, take kind of the agnostic approach. And you could have someone who's like, I lean more towards, religion, or I lean more towards atheism. But like right now, I genuinely am in the middle. I have no idea one way or another. Right. Like, it's okay to have that approach, and not just on the idea of whether or not a God exists. You can have that approach to anything in academia or science or history. You can say, oh, I just heard this weird fringe theory. And instead of being like, I have to like say why it's wrong and then make a fool of yourself because you don't know what you're talking about.
Well, what they do often, and I'm just using one example, many, they're actually going into this and something appears true to them. So it might be like one piece of evidence or a couple pieces of evidence that in their mind, they have a few presuppositions that it lines up with, and then it all of a sudden becomes true. And I'm like, suspend your you're buying something because something appears right now to be the case. Consider scholarship and see why they interpret these things or why they see things this way. Then do your own research and say, okay, first of all, and I'd love to hear them critique. All right, Dr. Bart Ehrman says this, and so-and-so says this, and Audio Fear and Ishay Rosensvee, and, you know, going in all these experts and then say, here's why I think they're wrong. But no, that's not what's happening. And so I love your caution. I love your suspended agnostic approach.
It's like something isn't true simply because, you know, Richard Price says it's true or because Bart Ehrman says it's true. Like something is true because it's true. And the evidence, you know, ideally would be sufficient to, you know, obviously some evidence doesn't last. It doesn't stick around. But, you know, until we have sufficient evidence, then you can have competing theories and you can lean heavily in one direction or another. And you can say this is more likely than the other. But again, you should know why people make those claims and why they lean that way, as opposed to just, well, so-and-so's really smart and they said a thing.
Exactly.
That's not to knock authority. Like if someone has spent an entire lifetime researching and studying something, and now not just one person, but you have thousands of people who've spent their lifetimes really diving into a field and learning the ins and outs and the culture and the language and the history and the archaeological findings, and they've gone and done digs. And like, if this is their existence and they eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff, and every single one of them is kind of coming to the same conclusion using different things that they found and different pieces of evidence. And then like sometimes those, you know, narratives are kind of changing as more evidence is found. And, you know, there might be an ongoing, extremely heated debate in academia about a particular issue until there's some new find or some new evidence. And, you know, they analyze it and make sure it's not a fraud and that it's, you know, from the right time period and it's got all this stuff. And then the consensus starts to shift, and there's reasons behind why they believe stuff. It's not that they always have perfect conclusions. It's not that they always get it right, but it's that based off of the best information available at the time that's been analyzed by people who do this for a living and have done it for years, that they've all come to a certain consensus, or that there's a couple competing theories. Like if you don't understand why they've reached that consensus or why people are arguing for two different positions, then it's just a really lazy way to believe something if you simply believe it because you heard it said.
But don't you know that the Illuminati is secretly I'm just kidding.
And so it's like, yeah, there's value in like who you heard say it and why. Like if it's like, you know, if you don't have time to research a topic and you don't have time to understand it, but you know that all of the experts are holding a particular position and it seems to comport with reality and it's not a life-changing decision, cool, like go with it. That's fine. Like it's not like you have to not waste, but like, it's not like you have to spend every single passing moment studying this stuff. Like it's okay to rely on people who have done the work on some of these things and to accept, you know, the conclusions that they've come to. But if you're going to go against that flow, against that grain, you better damn well sure know why you believe it, and not just because, like, you know, some blog that, you know, some anonymous blogger wrote something with, you know, out really presenting, you know, all of the both sides of the position and why it, you know, one side is right.
Well said. Well said. I only have one more question for you because I want to save plenty of the entree for future endeavors with you, potentially having scholars join us. I love your thinking and the way that you assess this information. I'm with you on this and the way that we are coming at this, trying to approach this topic as amateurs, as just independent, you know, podcasters, YouTubers, trying to, you know, get into the minds of the experts. And this is my final question. Are you located in the same location that genetically modified skeptic is? Because your background looks very, very similar.
I'm stealing his studio right now.
Dude, I could tell. I was like, hold on. That is the awesome background.
No, I came over to his house and I was like, hey, I've got an interview. Can I just prop up my laptop here and hop in? And he was like, yeah, go for it. So,
well, dude, I'm so glad you guys are friends.
I figured if I put, there's like a plant back there covering up the part that says genetically modified skeptic on his little silver YouTube subscribe plaque. And so I figured y'all would just think it was mine.
Well, you have one, so yeah, either way.
I do, but it's not behind me.
Dude, that's awesome, man. I just want to say thank you, bro, for coming on with me, giving me the opportunity to interview you, of course, to, explore these topics as two independent, amateurs in this field. But, like we get the firsthand eyewitness of some of these experts, and I'm interviewing Dr. Bart Ehrman tomorrow. So I'm extremely lucky that my audience has made that possible with the GoFundMe. And we're going to explore Christian apologetics with him on, because there's some Christian apologists who are attacking some of his stuff, saying he doesn't really know what he's talking about and he's trying to make the Bible not true. So we'll see what he says tomorrow. But thank you so much, man. Let's do this again.
Yeah, no, I've enjoyed it.
I seriously have too. I hope you guys have. Go in the description. Make sure you guys subscribe to his channel. If you like what he's saying, join his Patreon. You guys can harass him personally. He told me before the show. You guys can become a Patreon member, man. Help him out and doing what he's doing. He's part of the team. Like, this is what we want, and I'm passionate about it. I love everything he said. I hope you did too. Like the video, share it out there. Let's have him come back again. Maybe you guys have some ideas. And never forget, in case cognitive dissonance, and trust me, dissonance is a big thing, we are MythVision.